Welcome to the Sex and Space YouTube channel. We're about to show you a full video version of one of our awesome podcast interviews. You can check out the regular audio pod on all platforms where amazing podcasts are found. Be sure to hit us up with a like and subscribe, check out the socials for more content, and visit sexandspace.com to buy our book and our merch. All links are in the video description below. Without further ado, let's get into the interview.
Today, I have the privilege of chatting with Paul Barlow. Paul is a media and marketing veteran with a decade of experience spanning technology, entertainment, politics, and more. A former staff columnist, contributed to renowned New Zealand publications like Waikato Times, NZ Herald, and NBR. His expertise extends to crafting content and strategies for diverse industries, professional sports, cinemas, and concerts. But that's not all. No stranger to the world of media. He's worn various hats as a radio host, podcast producer, and presenter. In series, Paul, the other one, boasts a dedicated following of over 10,000 fans on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube. With a knack of delivering easily digestible insights and engaging long-form content, equally at ease behind and in front of the microphone. Paul, hello there. I thought I'd better say hello there.
Yeah. Hello there. Yeah,
Hello there.
I think that's what's going to be written on my gravestone at this stage. It follows me everywhere now.
Dude, I love it. I love it. I was excited about saying that, but thank you very much for coming on Sex and Space.
My
Very
pleasure. I
nice.
couldn't avoid a title like that. You have to, if somebody with a title like that for a podcast asks, you have to do it.
Yeah, excellent. Good. Well, that's right. The system's working for us then. Good
Yep.
stuff. And we've talked about Sex and Space amongst other things. Now, I mean, confession, right, for me, and I'm going to be fanboying all over the place. I really like what you do from a political and media commentary point of view, what the content that you put out on
Thank you.
TikTok, stuff like that, because for a while, I think New Zealand especially has actually needed something like that. I mean, I'm a sort of self-confessed consumer of political commentary on social channels. I mean, things like from like US, like Young Turks, Carl Kalinske, Jordan Cheriton, people like that, and then from the UK, which is where I grew up, people like Owen Jones, stuff like that. So, but yeah, for me, I mean, I think New Zealand politics is really interesting, but there's a certain sort of lacking in the sort of stuff that you do. And when I discovered what you're doing, I was like, oh, this is great. And but it's also beautifully dovetailed into Sex in Space as well, which we'll get to in a minute. But
Thank you.
Tell us,
Very kind of you to say.
Oh, that's good. Tell us about how you got into it. I'd love to.
So it was. So how I got to TikTok was a little bit strange because I actually downloaded it because of a client I was working with at the time in the sports industry, in the health and fitness industry. This client makes apps for fitness professionals, and they didn't believe that something like TikTok was going to be of any influence at all for their client base. And like, no, look, you can see it growing overseas. You can see it doing really well here. Let's download it, see how it works, what you have to do to actually get onto it and build a profile from it. So that's how I got to TikTok. And then I think like most people, I started off just doing what's trending. Let's give it a go. Let's see what works. And it wasn't until last year's local body elections when they started to roll around, and we had organizations like Voices for Freedom coming out going, we want to make the country ungovernable. And that's where my area of expertise had been in other fields that I'd done with the radio hosting, with the stuff I'd done for Stuff and the Waikato Times. And I thought, well, yeah, I've got a bit of expertise on this. I know some of these candidates personally. I know how terrible they would be if they were elected, if they were given any sort of authority, if they were given free rein to say what they wanted to say. It could actually be really dangerous. So I thought, I can focus on one or two candidates. And then after I started, I'd had people message me going, oh, have you heard about this candidate in New Plymouth? Or have you heard about this candidate in Rangataiki? People just kept throwing things at me. And so you do a little bit of digging, and these people are generally awful. Like that they have really backwards ideas about what society should be. They have really oppressive ideas around certain groups of people. And I felt, well, if I put it out there, then at least I feel like I've done something. And the audience just kind of grew and grew. And then we sort of hit election night last year, and like, well, now I can't stop because we've got another election in a year. So it's just about building up on that and then using things like the media theory training that I've had and going through like, how do we interpret the news? What is it that
Mm.
we're actually seeing? Why aren't we getting those kind of media personalities that you mentioned before from the US and the UK? Why do we not see that sort of thing come through here? And trying to give people the tools to interpret what's given to them in terms of information, but also what's presented to them by politicians as we go
Yeah.
into the election. So this election cycle has been far less about terrible people you shouldn't vote for, and much more about how something's presented, how you can interpret it, and what you really should be taking out from it, as well as how terrible some of the policies are that have been put out there.
Yeah. No, that's good. I mean, in this kind of broader international arena of mistrust, around certain media, but also around certain institutions and things like that. I think it's very interesting to sort of have a different perspective on what's just sort of fed to you.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
we can see from the time that Donald Trump kind of announced his presidency that he was going to run, all the way through to now, how we've seen media's trust degraded.
Mm.
There's research that's done every year through AUT, specifically looking into how much trust New Zealand media has with the audience. And that's showing the same trends. People are trusting media less and less, specifically old school news media, but
Mhm.
they still have the largest audiences in the country. So either people are hate watching it, or there is such a weird relationship that we have with the news and what we trust and the information that we're given. And part of the problem that we've got is that things like education around media theory wasn't really put into place until sort of the late 90s, early 21st century in this country. So people haven't grown up knowing how to interpret the news or how a story is told or what the messaging is. And the majority of people, for example, who go out and vote, they tend to be over the age of 50, 55. That's the generation that wasn't taught how to interpret media. They've just been
Mm.
presented it and it's evolved. And to me, there's just so many sort of moving parts. And I was really excited about the idea of just sort of sitting down and showing people how the sausage is made, really.
Yeah, yeah. No, it is interesting. You're absolutely right. There's so many moving parts, and they do interconnect too. And I think that's potentially a lot of the distrust is in around the complex
Oh
nature
yeah.
and those interconnected sort of parts of it too.
Oh
You
yeah.
know,
It,
yeah.
and it doesn't help that there are some organizations, for example, some groups that deliberately simplify things because it makes it easier to tell you that you can't trust these groups and can't trust the media. Like the most common one I come across is the government bribed media with the COVID fund, as an example,
Mhm.
and that's a huge, complicated issue in itself. Like, yeah, the government gave money to media, but it gave it to New Zealand On Air, and you had to apply for it, and you had to have a detailed breakdown. And New Zealand On Air has always published all of their funding decisions and the reasons why. You can find all this information. But for some people, it's just nicer in their heads to say, I can't trust the media because the government gave them money during COVID.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's frustrating, but fun.
Oh, absolutely. So I think that, I mean, the your appeal to me, and I suppose what it is you're trying to do, um, is to shine the light on the more nuanced,
Yeah.
complicated connections, and I mean, yeah, bring to light the fact this information is out there, or those sorts of things. Is that kind of right? Did you go into
Yeah.
this with a sort of motive?
Kind of. I think my
Yeah.
biggest motive is always to get people involved. When it comes to local body elections, I've always wanted to try and get the numbers up because they're abysmal. Like they're sub 35% in most places. And for this election, when Jacinda announced that she was retiring, the first thought in my head is that is going to tank the turnout for the election. We don't have that motivating factor that she brought with her.
Mhm.
And that anything I can do to get people out there to actually vote is really important. But also knowing specifically what you're voting for and how your vote has an effect, I thought was also important. But getting people involved was definitely the big part.
Yeah, yeah. That's totally true, and nicely sort of leads into sort of what I want to talk about next. Was a video that you put out about a month ago,
Mhm.
which was around RSE, which is reproductive and sexuality education. So that's our formal education around that subject in schools all three school ages, right? So
Yes.
primary, intermediate, and
And
secondary
secondary.
school. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And the whole system is designed to start when you start primary school and go all the way until you finish high school.
Mhm.
It's huge. Like, it's 30 years worth of research that's been poured into designing this particular education program. So it's a massive area and a really easy one for dog whistles to be made over.
Well, this is the thing, right? So this is what I wanted to ask you about. I wasn't sure how dog whistling this was. The example that you gave in your video was that the current leader of the opposition,
Mhm.
I don't know if that still technically is correct, because now we're 3 weeks out from the next election. But he was posed a question which I suppose was unhelpfully framed around woke ideology.
Mhm.
But it was around sexuality issues in the schools, and his opinion or soundbite or whatever you'd want to call it is that it should be dealt with at home by parents rather than in schools. And then it was the deputy
Mhm.
of the same party. She said something about she was concerned about indoctrination of kids, which felt
Yes.
quite whistly to me, but
Oh, yeah.
also that sexual education was a job for her and her husband, and teachers should be focusing on the basics and stuff like that. So I guess for those that haven't seen the video, you did a really nice job of firstly unpacking the importance and the massive benefits of
Thank you.
a good RSE. Could you just refresh us with those again, and also where you think New Zealand's RSE actually sits, kind of on a global
Yeah.
sort of leaderboard?
So in terms of the benefits that we see, and to be fair, the benefits that we're seeing are exactly what the research showed the benefits would be when this was implemented. So it's really important to know that that work for research and setting this up has paid off in dividends. It was things like a lowering of the number of STIs in the general population, especially in young people, a drop in teen pregnancy rates. You see a lot more talk and openness about anything to do with sexually related conversations that people might be having, both between their peers and their family. And those sort of open conversations can lead to things like a reduction in sexual assault, sexual abuse, those kind of issues.
Mhm.
And we're seeing all of those come through from how the system is being set up in this country. In terms of where it sits sort of internationally, from what I can see, it's pretty well up there. Like
Yeah.
because it's built on 30 years of research in the field, but also 30 years of academic research, we've taken sort of the best bits of it all and put it into action. The one thing that we kind of lack at the moment is we don't really give our teachers the tools to be able to do this effectively across every school and every education level. So they're given a booklet, they're given the information. How they connect with their students is entirely up to them, but it does make it a bit harder for there to be kind of a uniformity between each school. There will always be issues in certain schools, like a religion-based school, for example, is going to have a lot more trouble feeling comfortable having these
Yeah.
conversations with their students. But generally speaking, the results that we've seen have been really fantastic.
Yeah, that's really interesting and good news as well. I mean, my kids are 8 and 5, so yeah,
Yep.
fingers crossed. But I hear you, but it did. I mean, I personally had quite an open, flow of information from my parents as well,
Yeah.
which I really valued. But I think it is important that schools at least do a half decent job, because
hmm
the parents might not always be equipped, and like you said, the teachers as well. I mean, you could be talking about, again, different generations of education and
Yep.
stuff like that, right? So everybody kind of needs to be able to get the benefits of this, whether they're the
Yeah.
teacher. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And that's an interesting thing you bring up about your parents as well, because everybody's parents are different. And
Mm.
I'm in my 40s and I still feel uncomfortable sitting down with my parents if there's a sex scene on TV. If there's a movie that comes on. And like, I've got kids of my own. It's not like anybody is under any illusion as to how the process works. But I still feel uncomfortable around them. And my parents are incredibly liberal.
Mm.
I'm sure my kids are the same, but I can't say I've been in a room during a sex scene on a movie while I've been there in a very long time, because they tend to avoid it.
Yeah,
And it
yeah.
doesn't matter how liberal your parents are, it'll always be one of those uncomfortable topics. At least it being brought into schools in the way that it is at the moment, it means that you can sit there in an awkward situation with your parents, but at least know what's going on, what the mechanics are, how it fits into relationships, and all
Mm,
of that kind of stuff, and discuss it with somebody who you trust and don't feel quite so awkward discussing that with.
mm. Well, the other thing that, from my personal experience, kids talk with their peers
Oh,
too.
yeah.
And so if you're giving them the correct information that they're going to spread around between each other, it can dilute some of the misinformation, which is
Yes.
also rife.
Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely. And
yeah.
kids these days, they have access to Pornhub, for example. Like it's on the phones that they get sent to school with if they want it to be. And so we have to prepare them to be able to navigate that kind of world, because I guarantee at some stage someone's going to show up to school and go, "Oh my God, have you seen this?" And if you haven't
Mm,
given them the tools to handle that, all sorts of issues can crop up.
yeah, no, absolutely. What I thought was interesting about the two opinions of the leader of the opposition, Christopher Luxon, and her name
Nicola
escapes
Willis.
Nicola Willis. Yeah, and then you call her Nikki Haley for a minute, but she's American. But
I can
Nicola
see the resemblance there. Yep.
Nicola Willis, is that those sort of soundbitey opinions, there's not much room for nuance. I assume that those were maybe a press conference
Yeah.
kind of environment or something like that. There's not much room for the nuance. Like you just unpacked the benefits of, RSE, the teen pregnancies, all that kind of stuff. If all that's unpacked, who's going to be like, oh no, this is terrible. We should rip that up and start again. Like, surely not. But when you're dealing with, those political sound bites, do you feel, with the sort of media training that you've got, that's not really their opinion? Maybe it is, but it's
I
actually appealing to a base of people who are kind of like, you
I
know,
think it depends on the politician, to be honest, because we
yeah,
know, for example, Christopher Luxon he's an evangelical Christian. He's been
mm,
very open about his religious beliefs. And it's really common to find in those communities that they're much more comfortable feeling like they should control that flow of information for their kids.
yeah,
And I completely understand that every parent is going to have that feeling as well, that they want to make sure they know what their kids are talking about, what they're learning about, and adapting to where they feel their kid is in their developmental stage for this topic. And so I fully imagine that for Nicola Willis, it's the same sort of thing.
mm,
And you're right, when it comes to sound bites, you don't get nuance at all. But there is a dog whistle element to it as well. If they'd turned around and said, this is just an issue for family, which is sort of essentially what they put it down to, they're telling a specific audience, this is our stance where we sit on things. And that's an
mm,
audience that's it's generally very religious. They're generally very right-leaning in their politics, and they're generally really conservative. And that's kind of the brand that the National Party has to a degree, but it's
mm,
also a brand that you see a lot in almost our fringe parties at the moment. That especially that religious tie-in is very strong through things like New Conservatives, even New Zealand First to a degree, a whole bunch of these littler political parties. New Zealand Loyal plays it up quite a bit these days to the Freedoms umbrella with Brian Tamaki.
yeah,
And so it's a dog whistle to their followers that, oh, we're on the same page as you. In reality, the National Party set this up. So there should be no reason for them to go backwards and start saying it's not right. And I'm sure if you sat down with both of those politicians and said, give us a bit more nuance, you'd get it from them.
yeah,
But knowing that they've got a limited time with a soundbite, they try and get as many people to pay attention to it as possible. And that's where the dog whistle comes in.
yeah. It's one thing I wanted to just ask actually was around the personal opinions that Christopher Luxon has been pretty open about, with his
Hmm.
evangelical leanings. Where in sort of New Zealand lawmaking does the sort of the rubber hit the road when it comes to a politician's sort of personal perspective on certain things versus actual sort of law creation? And that's why I was also wondering, in the context of something like this, is not proposing that the current system gets ripped up and thrown in the bin, He's
No,
saying
not at
what he
all.
thinks. He's saying what he thinks will appeal to a certain voter base.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
right. Yeah.
it's a really interesting one because most of our laws are started either by a politician saying this is something that we need to change. We've identified it's an issue. Let's get it sorted, or by petition, where you have a number of people dropping off some form saying this is the change that we think we need. And laws are always running to catch up with changes in technology, changes in society. So when it comes to a politician's personal beliefs, it's not often that you'll see something that's done on a grand scale really quickly. The only exception that sort of comes to mind is the gun law changes after what happened in Christchurch.
Hmm.
And that was a really quick change because we knew really specifically where our politicians stood and understood where most of our politicians stood. And the personal choice to try and make gun safety laws tougher to get hold of those kind of weapons made a lot of sense.
Yeah.
When it comes to religious beliefs, they tend not to be quite so prevalent in the lawmaking process and how a party sets policy. One of the things I found most interesting with the National Party, for example, I had a chance to sit down and talk to our local national candidate. And I pointed out to him, I've got personal concerns about Luxon's religious beliefs. I don't see how somebody who thinks that abortion is murder is going to be quite happy to leave the abortion laws as they are, for example. And the response I got was, don't worry, we'll manage him. And I think there's always an element of people trying to manage those kind of beliefs from someone quite prolific in a party to something that's not quite so scary for the general population. But I also don't know how comfortable I am with the idea of a political party member managing their boss like that.
Hmm.
But in terms of the policy making process, I don't actually think it's going to make a huge amount of difference because I don't think you'd get the traction in the House for it.
Right. Yeah. So that's interesting. I mean, you can disagree with him up till the cows come home, and you could say that it's potentially harmful or unhelpful to broadcast or espouse
Yep.
too many of these sort of fringe views without looking at the nuance of actually RSC in schools in New Zealand is pretty good. Maybe there's room for improvement.
Yeah.
Blah blah blah. So okay, yeah, no, that's interesting because when you talk about the slightly smaller parties, which sometimes end up in coalitions,
Mm-hmm.
and they have some slightly more. Well, let's talk about the views of New Zealand first. Actually, when it comes to
Sure.
their sort of gender ideology views, do you want to unpack that one? You'd probably
Yeah.
nail it better than me.
So New Zealand First, this election, New Zealand First has always been a populist party. Winston does everything he can to get into Parliament, and he's been doing it for 40 odd years. So he's certainly very good at that. This election, though, he got a bit of a boost when he went down to the protests in Wellington in February of 2022. People saw him, some of the people in the protest saw him as a hero because he's a well-known face, a well-known name, and he's coming down to listen to us. And as we've sort of got closer and closer to the election, he's taken on board their views and their stances. He's even brought a number of those people into his party to showcase that this is where he's looking at going. One of the issues that you have with all of these fringe groups is that they're really good at what we call rage farming. And it's finding something new to be angry about every week. Initially it was mandates and vaccines, and then those were dropped. And then suddenly it's cloud seeding or 20-minute cities, or the one that they picked up on for a while there was around gender ideology and RSE. And some of it sticks, some of it doesn't. At the moment, we're seeing a lot of stickiness around gender ideology because we've got court cases, for example, with the Posey Parker stuff that's happening, and that's still in the news. So for those that get rage farmed and those that do the rage farming, it's really easy fodder to keep throwing at their people. New Zealand First picked up on that because they're dealing with those conspiracy crowds, which means that you get people like Kirsten Murfitt, who's his number 11 on the list. She is our most prolific QAnon supporter in the country. She's on Telegram all the time, putting out a whole bunch of conspiracy theory crap that makes no sense whatsoever. But her influence on the way that they create policy showcases that they're going to get traction from people paying attention to it from other crowds. And that's exactly what he needs for people to go, maybe he's a viable source for us to put into Parliament. So the policies he's put in place really specifically to talk to that crowd include no funding for sports organizations at all unless they sit down and they come up with a detailed plan on how to deal with transgendered people, ensuring that there are checks in public spaces for people's genitals to make sure they're going into the right bathroom. And like, that's extreme. Most people will tell you that's extreme. Nobody wants to have to submit for that. And somebody who's transitioning doesn't want to draw attention to that in the first place. It is a really cruel, heartless policy, but it's one he's adopted because those rage-farmed crowds have told him that's what he wants, and he's so close to getting into Parliament, it makes sense for him to push that narrative these days.
Right, so he's just looking for a threshold of above 5%, and if he's going to get it, through whatever means, yeah.
Oh yeah. The interesting tell though on how he himself feels about it is like, because Winston's hard to read. He will lie till he's blue in the face and make you believe it. But if you have a look at his actual party list, he would need to get the same sort of support that he had 2 or 3 elections ago, where he's getting 15, 18 candidates in before the first conspiracy theorist would actually make it onto that list. He's actually put them down quite a way. So he's still placating, look, they're on the list, and if we do really well, they'll get in. But the reality is, where he's playing on the fringes at the moment, if he gets in, he'll get 6 candidates, 3 of which are already have already been MPs. One of which is an incredibly racist person who works for Hobson's Pledge, and the other couple are like former local body politicians, so they have a little bit of governance experience. So on paper, that sounds good. And to the conspiracy theorist that he's talking to, yeah, look, he's giving us something. He's throwing us, the candidates are doing really well, and we could, because he's done it in the past, get all of those people in. So he's playing the game pure and simple.
Gotcha. Yeah, it's interesting how in terms of the game, the broader game, and the kind of interconnectivity of media's sort of role in this. How much do certain topics that are sort of, I guess, hot button topics amongst certain crowds? How much are they sort of out of balance or pushed because of that media kind of? I mean, if you call rage farming one thing, is click farming something else?
Click farming is very similar. The big difference is rage farming keeps people angry, click farming keeps people engaged. And news works on click farming these days. It's where the advertising dollar comes from. It's how they sell themselves, especially mainstream media. But what you find, if you look at something like a mainstream media post on a platform like Facebook, for example, and it's around the rugby, or it's around traffic chaos in Auckland, that kind of stuff, you'll get really minimal engagement. You might get a couple of likes, a couple of comments. Even rugby these days, because the All Blacks aren't doing as great as we would like, is the sort of thing that people don't engage with as much. But if you were to put down this week's COVID numbers, for example, which we haven't seen in the media for a couple of months, you would get so many responses, you get so much engagement, that suddenly that's the kind of thing that as a social media manager, you go, oh, this is the engagement levels that I want. And as somebody who dictates what makes news, is the kind of thing you go, oh, this is what people are talking about, so this is how we put it on the news, and we keep it big. We saw a great example of that last week, actually, or the other day, with Ryan Hamilton, the National Party candidate for Hamilton East. He made the news on Radio New Zealand about 7 o'clock in the morning because he holds anti-fluoride, anti-vaccine, anti-mandate beliefs. And they found footage, they found proof of that on his social media feeds and on other social media feeds. And by the time he hit the 6 o'clock news, it was one of the top 3 headlines. Radio New Zealand didn't even put it out on their social media feeds, but it was picked up by people who were paying attention. By 10:30, Luxon was being grilled about it in stand-ups. And then all of that sort of engagement that we see through social media drives what we see through mainstream media. And the people who are involved in these conspiracy theory groups, they actually have threads where they'll say, hey, look, this has been posted on this, go and comment, go and bomb it. So those engagement levels go up. So it starts to dictate what we're seeing in mainstream media in terms of the communications that they're putting out and the messages that they're putting out.
Right, gotcha. And so you understand that game, and you unwind it right back to Christopher Luxon's comments around whether RSE, should be in home or school. And it's right back to what we said before. It's interconnected, isn't it? So he's trying to play a game where those comments of his might end up
Yeah.
being on the 6 o'clock news as well. So
Yeah, exactly. And they worked. They made the news headlines. And you'll see it, especially in the lead up to the election. Every politician wants that soundbite that makes the news. We're seeing it quite a bit with, there's a Vision candidate at the moment who's running in one of the South Auckland seats, who's popped up to 3 different party leader events now. He's broken in and he's disrupted, gets him on the news. So that's what the discussion's about. It's really quite a challenging balancing act, especially when there's so many people who want to be on the news at the moment and only so much time that the news can actually put aside for it.
yeah, it's very interesting. It's but you're right, you can see it play out in real time when you know there's important stuff being talked about, but then the trending stuff, you know, will pop up. There was something this morning, actually. The New Zealand Herald published a list of Russell Brand's ex-girlfriends. He's in the news right now for, you know, the reasons that he's in the news for, but I didn't feel like that list was relevant at all. It was just that people are talking about Russell Brand, so here's a list of his ex-girlfriends. So I was like, okay. And once you start to see it, you're like, okay.
There's a great example actually from September 1997, which, being British, I'm pretty sure you might be able to work out what the big event was that happened in September 1997. There was a crash in Paris. I think it was the Daily Mail had to pull all of their pre-printed copies off for that morning because it was all about the terrible sexcapades of Princess Di and what she was doing and how she was having all of these different affairs and she'd taken all these different lovers. And they actually had to run a retraction that they put out saying, look, we apologize for putting this out and we've removed most of the copies of the sexcapades of Princess Di, and we'll bring you a 72-page memorial on the life of the people's princess. Because that narrative changes so suddenly, and it's faster these days because of how connected we are with the internet. But it's a great example of how public perception changes what the media puts out there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, now it's lightning fast. It's it's interesting. But I mean, I think for someone like you, what you're doing and what you're able to help educate people with, it's a little bit like the RSE stuff. You know, information is power. The more you talk about this sort of stuff, the more you understand it, the more, you know, nuanced sort of opinion you can have. But no, I feel it's very, very, very valuable, actually.
I hope so. We'll find out on election day, I guess, if it worked.
No, I mean, to be honest, I haven't noticed. No, I mean, I have noticed a political leaning from your stuff, but I think you do try and keep it quite fact based.
I try
don't know.
and keep
It seems to.
Yeah. I always find the feedback really funny depending on who I'm talking to. So I've got some friends, for example, who are working on Labour Party campaigns around the country, and they'll say to me, "Oh, we love the balance in what you're doing. It's really well balanced." I'm like, "Yeah, but if you think it's balanced, then clearly it's not, because you've got this bias going on." So it's always a tricky one, but I try and make sure that there's at least some base facts in there before I throw my own spin on it.
Have you experienced much pushback or anything like that? Like how's that
Occasionally,
unfolded for you?
I get I haven't had it quite so much these days, but I got a lot of, "You must be a paid government shill because you're not agreeing with everything we say." That generally comes from those conspiracy theory crowds. I have had 4 death threats so far, and they've all come from Destiny Church members. A lot of the smaller parties and the smaller party supporters like to jump in and yell in all caps and stuff like that, but I haven't had that much online recently. Physically, I've been chased down by helpers of the Vision Party, the local Vision Party candidate here on the North Shore. I wasn't particularly impressed with them blocking up footpaths with their mobile billboards, and went and pulled the fingers at their sign and stuck it up on Instagram. And their local Man Up organizer chased me down, me and a friend, and tried, like, he's a foot shorter than I am. He was trying to stand over me and right in my face, yelling and screaming and getting ready to punch me.
Oh dear.
There can be some really highly emotive people around these things. And I get it. Like,
Mm.
it's when it comes to politics, you're literally dealing with the future of the country. You should be kind of worked up and emotive, but you also shouldn't be at a point where you feel like hitting somebody is the way to fix that.
No.
But yeah, I don't think I've had anything too dramatic recently, the last month or so.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting because I feel like I don't know that people are necessarily, and you are right. I'm sure that some people are conflating the importance
Oh yeah,
of the future of the country, but I feel for some people it's more of just a tribal game. There's a bit of
yeah,
validation going on for their own opinions and stuff like that. So that's definitely really different for me growing up. I mean, I'm in my 40s too. When I first voted, it was much less. It was much less tribal. Yeah, it's been interesting. And actually, you mentioned before, or just now, Destiny's Church, and
mhm,
that's another interesting one. If we look at how they use, I don't know that they've necessarily dived into the RSE conversation, but they've definitely, approached this whole indoctrination of children, the sort of LGBTQ agenda and stuff like that. Now, obviously, they are religious in their sort of base,
mhm.
but that seems to me, and I could be wrong, but very sort of cynical use of those topics,
Oh yeah,
because I don't know what intention or real chance they've got of making it into Parliament this time. But from a financial revenue point of view, it's probably helping them a lot. Am I
yeah.
on the
You're
right
bang on the
track with
money
that
there.
one?
Brian Tamaki has tried a number of times to get into Parliament, and he fails miserably every time. He does everything he can to talk about what he considers traditional family values. 20 years ago, he was running protests against same-sex marriage down in Wellington. Like
Mm,
it's really ridiculous reactionary stuff. And over the years, he's made some really stupid claims. Like the LGBT community calls the earthquakes in Christchurch as punishment from God.
yep,
Those
that's
kind
it.
of things are designed. It's a stupid statement. Like it
Yeah.
really is. And everybody generally recognizes it as him trying to get attention. And every time he gets attention, it's an extra chance for him to grift money off people. One of the things I found really fascinating about Tamaki this time and his freedoms group that he's put together, like they don't like each other. There's groups, for example, like Outdoors and Freedom. Their number 2 person on their list, she is Wahine Māori. She's very proudly Wahine Māori. And you've got somebody like Rock the Vote, who are really racist, and they've got actual policies that are like you can't use Te Reo language anywhere in the country in certain places. Like that it's really never going to work in one room.
Yeah.
So clearly there's an ulterior motive for it. But with Brian, everything he does is to get attention, and if he's got attention, people are giving him money. My favorite one actually is during COVID, where we wouldn't get vaccinated. We don't stand for vaccinations. He hired a vaccination station space outside his own church, and then he had to travel. He went overseas just after lockdowns lifted, and at the time, you couldn't travel without being vaccinated. So clearly, he got vaccinated,
Hmm.
but he's still telling people he would never do that. That's not possible. And those conversations and arguments that happen within those groups drive people to him. And those are the ones who are like, if you give me the money, I can get rid of the government. We're going to get 20% of the vote so we can fix things. Never going to happen, but people will pay him handsomely for it.
Yeah. All right. So it's so sad because I've never really unpacked it too far, but I sort of feel like a deep colonial guilt in a way for some of the communities that are attracted to some of his worst messaging. And yeah, I don't know. I just
I
can't
know where
deal
you're
with it.
coming from,
Yeah.
though.
Yeah.
It's the communities he appeals to and that he does really well in are the ones that do feel like they've been let down by successive governments, that feel like
Mm,
communities aren't talking to them, that they don't feel like they have a place of belonging in their own country. And so this is something they can latch onto because he makes them feel like they're accepted and that they're part of his community and part of his flock.
Mm.
To me, as somebody who's not religious, that feels like taking advantage of these people. But to these people, it feels like a lighthouse in the fog.
Yeah. Yeah. Golly, it's sad, isn't it? Um, interesting. But okay, let's not get too
Let's
sad
not get
about
too depressed by Brian Tamaki. He'll be irrelevant in 4 weeks.
Oh, I hope so.
Yeah,
Yeah, good. All right, I'm holding you to that actually.
absolutely.
Yeah, good stuff. All righty then. Let's we can probably wrap this up. Is there anything that you've got coming up that you because yeah, I think we've got 3 weeks, haven't we, till our
We've got
election?
3 weeks until the election.
3 weeks
Yep.
till election. Yeah. What are you up to
Election,
in the intervening?
seeing what hits the news is
Yeah.
essentially it. I want to try really hard to make sure people are informed before they get out there and vote.
Yeah.
Advanced voting opens in, I think, 2 weeks' time. It's sort of the first week of October. So making sure people are enrolled, making sure people know how they're going to vote and why they're going to vote that way is really important.
Mm-hmm.
And then trying to get to election day. I'm actually fronting a news show, a radio station broadcast for election night. And then after the election, I'm going into hiding and running off to Asia for like a month in November just to
Yeah.
escape for a little bit.
Let's go for a little bit. Well done.
Yeah.
I tend to jump onto that vote compass thing.
That's a really good tool.
Yeah, I
The
find
vote
that's
compass and
quite good to
Policy
get rid
NZ.
of all the noise. Yeah, Policy NZ.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. Policy NZ is, I think, the spin-off, and it gives you a really nice broad breakdown of each of the party's policies and each of the candidates in your electorate. So that's
Okay.
a really good way to have a little bit more information about the people that you could work with directly in your community. Vote Compass is really good for a generalized, this is where you sit on the spectrum kind of thing. It
Yep.
does tend to lean a little bit righter than most people feel they are, but it's also a great tool to be able to sit down and go, okay, this is where I kind of fit in the spectrum, and I don't agree with this, but I do agree with that.
Yeah. No, that's good. All right. So people should be getting out and doing those sorts of things. Is that sort of the philosophy that you would take into your decision making? I mean, I guess knowing everything you do about media and politics and the game and the silliness of it all is to literally go policy over personality and
Yes. Yeah. I will vote for a party or a person I think would actually represent me best in Parliament. But I'd thoroughly recommend as well for anybody who doesn't know what's being on offer, go to a Meet the Candidates event. They're a really interesting way to sit down and see how your candidates communicate, how they interact with other people, how the audience reacts to them as well. Because if you've got a candidate who doesn't work well with an audience and with the community, how well are they going to be able to represent them in Parliament? So I would always recommend going along to one of those meetings and making sure that you are sort of armed with information that you want to know, because you usually have a chance to ask a question or write a question, and make sure that you sort of get the answer that you want. Politicians are really great at avoiding answers, like across the political spectrum.
Yeah.
So asking a simple question with a simple answer that gives you a direction for yourself, I think, is a really important tool to be able to use as well.
Awesome. All right. Well, that's great. Well, that's totally worth doing because I think a lot of people have just checked out and they're like, two dudes called Chris.
Yeah, and that's it exactly. It's two middle-aged white dudes named Chris who both like going to the beach, who both don't want to change the laws around marijuana, and it's just they're so same. They even bought a house at the same age. It's ridiculous.
Oh, don't tell me it was like 22 or something, was it?
24.
24.
They were
Okay.
both 24 when they bought their first house. I think it's a great opportunity for people to look at smaller parties and what they have to offer this election.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that's good. Good call. Apart from some of the really small fringe ones, but actually being aware of what they offer.
Not a minnow party.
Not a minnow party, yeah. But also being informed and being aware of what even those minnow parties offer, so you can kick that shit curb is.
Yeah, exactly. Because it might sound good on paper, but when you actually deal with them, you talk to them, you see what their social media presence is, you'll get an idea as to what it is that they actually stand for.
Yeah, good. So what was your own sex education like?
I was very lucky that my parents were incredibly liberal. But I think that the first kind of sexual awakening moment that comes to mind would have been I think preteen, and my parents sitting down going, you have to watch the Rocky Horror Picture Show.
Oh,
Like
really?
it's my mother's
Yeah,
favorite film.
yeah,
But it's definitely one of those things that as you know, a 9-10-year-old, it's one of those, well, this is interesting. Ooh,
yeah. I've got
that's a
some
very
questions.
disgusting. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. My parents have always been very open and allowed us to talk about those kind of things. Um, and I think it because I've got two siblings, they all had very different sort of attitudes towards sex and
Mm.
relationships growing up. And yeah, I don't know that we all had the same sex education awakening moment though. So
Yeah,
it's a
yeah,
tough one to call. As the oldest, I probably got the raw end of the stick of, oh, we could try this when he's 9, and then finding out, no, it's probably not a good idea. We'll wait till the next one's a little bit older.
yeah. Try again. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
exactly.
I think what's been interesting actually is, like I said before, I'm in my 40s as well, but doing a podcast like this, um, I guess I feel now like the education hasn't really stopped. It's just, it's just
It
happening
just
now in
keeps
my
going.
40s. Yeah, it kind of keeps going.
Yeah,
But Rocky Horror Picture Show, I think that and Top Gun are probably my two most watched movies ever. So
yeah,
yeah, I don't know what that says
yeah.
about me, but
See, I,
it's a good
I
one.
was really lucky that years ago when they did the unveiling of the Riff Raff statue in Hamilton, because he's got a big statue down there. I was part of the organising committee for a couple of screenings of double feature picture shows.
Awesome.
So I got to meet Richard O'Brien. I got to take my mum to meet Richard O'Brien, and then we got, I don't know if you can actually see them. I've got these two here, which are like the original posters from it behind
Oh
Groveyard.
yeah, yeah,
There's only 4 of those sets in existence, and my parents have one of those sets because of that. And it's like, this
yeah.
is how I could thank you for ruining me as a child. You can have his autograph.
All right. Well, this has been awesome. Thank you heaps.
Oh,
And
my pleasure. Thank you.
yeah, thanks for talking about the sex education side of things. Keep up the good work
Thank
as
you very
well.
much, Tim. You have a good
I'm
one.
gonna You too, man. Catch you later.
See ya.
See ya.